It's Tuesday, and I just booked myself out of here. One more week, and I'm down south where it's warm for the holidays. Going to meet up with my family, my mom and dad, and hang out. It's so important to spend the time you can with your parents because life doesn't go on forever, as we know, right? I always go. I don't want to miss it. I have been talking about some provocative subjects the last, while, where a lot of people think they're provocative. And one thing, that happened to me the other day was and it's happened several times now, being inferred that I am an Islamophobe. I want to talk about that because nothing could be further from the truth. Um, I was doing Airbnb, as many of my friends know, in my time of, coming out of burnout and getting myself back to the girl I used to be. I did Airbnb to pay the bills. Nothing ever stays small with me. I, ended up having several properties going, bringing in my buddies on it, and I encountered a lot of people. Now, of course, I had a background in service. When I was 12, I started in my first service fast food restaurant job. I worked in hospitality until I was 26 years old, full time. Did everything from front end to the back end. So Airbnb, it was super easy. It was a no-brainer, really. Uh, it was a fantastic experience for, the first 3 years. It was wonderful. But in year three, I was exposed to a guest I had never had before. It was actually the beginning of year three. And in my town, Airbnb was really new. I was the first listing here. So generally, I got working guys that were here on shutdowns. Airbnb took a few years to really get rolling. I didn't get that many guests. I would get Europeans, the odd immigrant coming into Canada, largely from India. That seemed to be my bread and butter there for a while. So I encountered, again, a lot of different cultures in my home. Although I had all of these cultures, what I didn't ever look at was the religion. So when the first Muslim young man showed up on Airbnb, of course, I was just my normal self, but I felt a real air of distrust of me, fear of me. And I didn't understand it. I tried to be friendly. I tried to, he was coming from the Middle East. So, he didn't speak a ton of English. But I got the impression he was trying to avoid me. And he was. In fact, I would go out and put the garbage out, and he would have snuck downstairs and put his food in the microwave and back upstairs. Everywhere he could, he would avoid me. Now, he was with me for a week, so this whole thing was a little disconcerting because it was something I'd never experienced with any of my other guests. And by that time, I'd had about 100 guests on Airbnb. And then also renting rooms, to the working guys that were in town. That was my bread and butter at the time. Then, the strangest thing happened. I came home one day and his shoes, of course I'd shown him where to leave his shoes at the front door and stuff. His shoes were, in the middle of the landing and right on the bottom stair. And I thought, that's weird. So I moved them. The next day, I came home, and his shoes were halfway up the stairs, right in the middle. Now I had other guests coming, so I was like, what's going on with this? But, of course, I grabbed them and I put them back downstairs. The next day, I go upstairs to go to the bathroom, and they're on the first landing, right in the middle. What the hell's going on here? The next day, at the top. At that point, I grabbed them and I put them outside his door. I never asked him about it because it was just weird. And of course, he was avoiding me, so it made it really difficult to discuss what the heck that was all about. When he left, I felt, it was just a really awful feeling, and I couldn't describe it at the time. And in fact, I started Googling, combinations like man leaves shoes in the middle of the stairs and these types of things, and I wasn't getting anywhere. And it was a few months later till I got my second male Muslim guest. Now, in all of these years, okay, so 4.5 years with having Muslim guests in my home, I only saw girls twice. Both times delivered to my house, to actually right to their room, veiled, and they weren't allowed to talk to me. And those were the only 2 girls. In fact, I was worried that one of them was being trafficked. In any case, getting back, the second Muslim guest shows up. And he was cool. Young guy. He was in his early 20s. I'll never forget him. Him and I really hit it off. And just talking, and he was going to school in Toronto. Of course, he was Muslim, but he grew up in Canada. So there wasn't the same air of fear that the first one had had. And of course, after the first one, you're like, oh, well, maybe, he's new in Canada, maybe he's scared, and, you make these excuses. But then the train started rolling, and they were more frequent and more frequent. I was still getting the Indian guests, again, travelers from all over the world, business people, but then I started to experience problems. And they were the conservative Muslims, not liberal. And this is where we don't make a determination, and I never did in the past because I didn't understand it. But it was that air of them being scared of me. And I started to dig into that research-wise to try to figure it out. Why? What am I doing wrong? Of course, we're socialized here to believe that, well, it must be you. And so I dug in. And then I found it. Now, actually, I have to qualify this. In the meantime, Trump had been elected. And, I did not like his attitude that we were seeing with the travel restrictions and all of that. That bothered me. I believe that we should all be able to be entitled to live any way we choose. But when I started to dig in, I actually, it was about my 40th video, and I learned that where a Muslim man leaves his shoes basically defines the boundary of the filth beyond. And it was at that very moment I realized that I was the filth. Every time he left his shoes there, it was his belief that I was rubbish, garbage. And I finally understood what I'd been feeling the entire time he'd been here. In my experiences, I found that 50% of the time, it was too much not to notice. In fact, I started to say something. And I started saying something to Airbnb. And I was shocked that they just didn't care. I had men asserting their dominance in my home because they would come in and they were fine. It seemed everything was great. I would ask if everything was okay, if they needed anything. Of course, there was always other people around. Of course, some of my guests will remember it was always pretty active at my place. And, conversation, talking about, where you're from and what's going on and what's your adventure. Yet the Muslim male guests never participated. They never wanted to be part of that. And what I started seeing happening was discrimination from them against me. And how they did that was they took it out in their review, where the two other guests would say, Martine was amazing. She's so communicative and so helpful. And that's me. They would say I was a terrible communicator, that I didn't clean my house, that it was like all the womanly things they hit me on. They commented on me being not friendly. And that was, nothing could have been further from the truth. I treated them just the same way as everybody else. They didn't want to be around us. We tried to include them, and they wouldn't have anything. They wouldn't have it. When I started to see this come out in my reviews, I took it hard with Airbnb. I was adamant, and 3 times I had to get these reviews literally removed. And I started to see a pattern, and I couldn't deny what was before my very eyes. I had the experience, I had the documentation. What was interesting with Airbnb is, this became more of a problem than they were willing to admit. In fact, there's a whole Muslim Airbnb operation going on now because of the cultural differences. My point is, well, we're not at the point yet. What I was absolutely horrified with, more than those interactions, was some women friends and men friends of mine whom, when I would talk or try to talk about what I was going through, I got this "you're a racist" edge. And I was just horrified. And I remember one day telling a former girlfriend about it. And I could feel her back getting against the wall. I could. And of course, that made me defensive. And as I was telling her, I could see her looking at me like I was not a nice person. Yet in fact, I was the victim of racism, of preconceived ideas that are being taught in the religious realm about us Western people. She couldn't see it. Yet, what really got me was the realization that had I been describing white guys with that behavior, they would have been up in arms. Toxic masculinity, the patriarchy. Yet I was dealing with the patriarchy. This is how blinded the left has us these days, that we have stopped looking at the facts and winging out judgments of phobias, Islamophobe, transphobe, this phobe, that phobe. It's bullshit. And because of these terms, people like me continue to be, well, of course I was silent, and apparently you're getting to know me now, and you know that does not last for long before I pipe up and say something. But I was amazed at the fact that I could have gone through this and actually had my business impacted by pure racism against Western women, taught to these men that are now immigrating to Canada, teaching their children the very same values. Because we've got to know that Muslim people are generally living together amongst themselves. They don't want the interaction. They don't believe in a multicultural Canada in the way that we believe in it. They're a society within a society. That's the reality. And the more do I dislike Muslim people? No, I am about free will. You practice the religion you want. You practice whatever. I don't care who you marry. I don't care who you identify with. I don't. But when you come here and have these ideas against the country you are to be embracing, we have a idea that you should be embracing those values too. But that's just not the case. Multiculturalism, the definition, its intent, and how it's rolling out today is completely different than the original and what we grew up believing. All one. It's not that way anymore. And to continue to just brush these issues under the carpet are crazy because we've got oil and water. We're talking about being acceptant of everyone identifying with who they want to be. Do you think it stops with women? It doesn't. They don't like gays. They stone them to death just like women. They certainly don't accept transgenders. They don't accept any of it. Yet this is the world we're creating over here. It doesn't mix with this one. I don't know what the answer is. I have no idea. We have refugees. We have migrants who are making their way here to Canada. And we're still small enough to determine, population-wise, to determine how best to make that happen. But I have to ask this question. Should we be embracing people who don't embrace us into our country? I'm not so sure. Something to ponder on. And I hope you will. And I hope you'll actually look beyond this simple narrative to shut you up and shut you down. When somebody calls you phobic, that infers fear. I'm not fearful of Muslims. But I also don't see the point of throwing myself into a pit that I can't win, in which I know for fact I'm going to suffer from discrimination. It makes no sense to me. Have a wonderful day.